Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're very excited for our first C21 event for the fall semester. You may have seen our fall magazine for the C21 Center. And as many of you know, the Church in the 21st Century Center is a catalyst and resource for the renewal of the Catholic Church. And we focus on four focal areas: handing on the faith, roles and relationships in the church, sexuality in the Catholic tradition, and the Catholic intellectual tradition. And this semester, our theme is Living Catholicism, Roles and Relationships for the Contemporary World. And if you haven't picked up the magazine, we're very proud of it. And this is an exciting time to be a Catholic. And who would have thought I would say that? I don't want to speak for all of you, but it's pretty exciting in my book. And even adding to the excitement, we have Father Michael Himes here this evening. Before we introduce our beloved speaker, I do want to let you know our events for the semester are on the back inside cover of the magazine. Coming up on October 23rd, we have Phyllis Zagano speaking about women deacons, past, present, future, exploring that possibility. On October 30th, we have John Allen, the world-renowned Vatican correspondent, who's going to speak in Robsham Theater on the Francis papacy regarding revolution, renewal, resistance. And so we will hear from one of those great speakers there. Tonight's speaker, Father Himes, will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll welcome your questions for about 20 minutes. And just so you know, we're filming, and we post all of our events on video about 2 weeks afterwards. So that being said, I would like to thank Father Himes for your guest editor work and help and guidance on this wonderful magazine issue. I want to thank David Turnblum also for helping us through this as assistant editor. And I give Karen Kiefer credit. She's out running one of our many events for Espresso Your Faith Week. Many of you know about that. Karen Kiefer is the managing editor of C21 Resources magazine. Let us begin our event. David Turnblum, I've asked to introduce Father Michael Himes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Turnblum, and today I have been given the honor of introducing Father Michael Himes. Father Himes was ordained a priest in the Diocese of Brooklyn in 1972, and after earning his doctorate at the University of Chicago, Father Himes served as Dean of the Seminary of the Immaculate Conception on Long Island in New York. He was also Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, and currently Father Himes teaches here at our beloved Boston College. Among his many publications are titles such as Doing the Truth in Love, Conversations about God, Relationships, and Service, as well as The Mystery of Faith, An Introduction to Catholicism. In my time here at Boston College, I have had Father Himes as a professor. I have worked with him as his teaching assistant. He was the head of my doctoral comprehensive examination board, and I was privileged to work as his assistant in editing this magazine. I have been blessed with many opportunities to learn from Father Himes, and he has certainly had an impact on my scholarship, my teaching, and my spirituality. This evening, we are all blessed with another opportunity to learn from Father Himes. Please join me in welcoming Father Michael Himes.
Thank you, David. Well, good evening, and thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to have you here, and it's a great pleasure to speak with you. I just have to make one short correction. David Turnblum was far more than an assistant in editing this magazine this fall. I was his assistant. David was the real editor of the journal, and so everything you find in there that is praiseworthy and that pleases you, that's David. The misspellings, the typos, those are mine. So, what I decided to do as a way of organizing what I want to talk with you about this evening is I decided to turn to another distinguished journal, namely America. The issue that had the long and much discussed interview with Pope Francis and to take that interview as my text, that I'm going to look at several key points in the interview and expand on them, comment on them, and perhaps suggest some ways they might in fact plug into one another, the way they hold together as a consistent vision. And the first of those points that I have four. The first of those points that I'd like to talk with you about is the point at which, he actually comes back to this twice again after the first discussion of it in the interview, where the Holy Father talks about the familiar Jesuit image of sentire ecclesiam, thinking with the church, to think along with the church. Actually, it means, it's even more striking in Latin. In Latin, it's not strictly speaking to think with the church, it's to think church. That the church is what's going on in your mind when you're thinking about it. That's what Ignatius is talking about, sentire ecclesiam. And what the Pope says about it, I absolutely applaud. I'm sure that makes him feel very good, by the way. I'm sure in Rome right now, the Holy Father is saying, oh, thank God, Hymes agrees with me. And I do. Let me quote the particular passage where he first takes up this question. Here it is. He says, "The image of the church I like is that of the holy, faithful people of God. This is the definition I often use, and there is also that image from the Second Vatican Council's dogmatic constitution on the church. Belonging to a people has a strong theological value. In the history of salvation, God has saved a people. There is no full identity without belonging to a people. No one is saved alone as an isolated individual, but God attracts us looking at the complex web of relationships that take place in the human community. God enters into this dynamic, this participation in the web of human relationships." That marvelous image of God being present in the web of human relationships. Now, why is that so important? Well, because in our time, it's certainly in this country, but I think it's also true largely of most countries in Western Europe. I don't know that it's true at all in the Pope's native Latin America. I don't know that it's true in Africa or in parts of Asia. I think it's also very true in Australia, by the way. Most Western, distinctly Western countries, there has been a tendency in the last, let us say 35 or 40 years, there has been a tendency to think of one's personal relationship with God as being of great importance, but one's communal relationship with one another and with God as being relatively unimportant. So, for example, I'm sure we've all bumped into people who say this. You may say it yourself, as a matter of fact. I'm really very interested in my spiritual life, but no, I don't really belong to any church. I don't really belong, there's no community that I identify with. It's very much a case of God and my personal relationship with God, which really has nothing to do with anybody else. And what the Pope is saying here is that that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the way in which God relates to us. That God relates to us precisely by being in relationship. If you think about the very first chapter of Genesis, there's a very fascinating way in which this is said in Genesis. You remember that on the afternoon of the sixth day, God has created the universe, has filled it with animals and plants, and on the afternoon of the sixth day, since God is going to rest on the Sabbath, of course, that God creates the first human being. And for the first time, he stops and contemplates ahead of time, at least the way Genesis 1 tells the story. God contemplates what he's going to do and takes a blueprint. Previously, all God has done is to say, let there be whatever, and it happens. And God looked at it and saw that it was good. But on the afternoon of that sixth day, Friday afternoon, God is depicted as pausing and saying, now let us make the human being in our image and likeness. He stops and thinks about it before he does it, and he takes something as a model. Let's make ourselves the model. I'll be the model for human beings. Let us make the human being in our image and likeness. And therefore, the Hebrew text says, the actual word means precisely that. And therefore, for that reason, for what reason? For what we've just heard. In order to be in the image of God, he made us male and female. Now, what does that mean? Well, it does not mean that God is sexually undecisive. That is not what it's about at all. What it's saying is, what in that wonderfully graphic, solid, material, Hebraic imagination that marks so much of the Hebrew Scriptures, notice that what God does is to take the most obvious thing about us as human beings, the most obvious and unmistakable and undeniable fact about what it is to be a human being, and say that that's what makes us in the image and likeness of God. And what is that undeniable fact about human beings? We're gendered. We come in two varieties. We're male and female. And what does maleness and femaleness tell you? It tells you we're made for one another. We're supposed to be in relationship with one another. Human beings aren't supposed to live in isolation. It's not good for the human being to be alone, God says in the second chapter of Genesis, that human beings are meant to be in community. And why? Because that is what makes us in the image and likeness of God. That God is a kind of communal reality. Now let me just point out quickly again, throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, God is never simply described, or almost never, is simply described as God. God is always the God of somebody. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel, the God of Moses, the God of Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel, the God of David, the God of Solomon. He's always the God of somebody. He's never simply God. He's always God as God is found in a relationship with somebody. That's a very remarkable thing. I suggest to you that it is the remote origins in the Hebrew Scriptures. I'm not implying that the authors of the Scriptures were sitting there thinking this but not writing it down. It's the remote origin of an insight that will become our doctrine of the Trinity. That when we speak of God, we're not speaking about the one, we're speaking about the relatedness of the three. That we're not talking about one individual named God whom we enter into a friendship with. We're talking about a relationship that we incorporate. You see, what we're suggesting is, what has always been suggested in the Christian Scriptures, is that God is more like a relationship than God is like a person. Now, God is like a person in significant ways, especially it's much easier to think of talking to a person than talking to a relationship. It's easier to talk to someone you love and who loves you than to talk to love. But the fact is that that is closer to what we mean by the word God than to think of God as being an agent in a relationship. It's not that God is a lover, it is that God is love, says the first letter of John, chapter 4, verse 8 and 16. God is like a relationship. So if you want to be in communion with God, you've got to join in that kind of relationship. That's what the first letter of John says in the very strongest terms. Anyone who says he loves God whom he's never seen, but does not love the neighbor whom he does see, the term is usually translated as lying, but in fact the Greek means something a little closer to is talking nonsense syllables, is babbling, is saying something that's untrue because the poor dolt doesn't know any better. That the person doesn't know what he means when he talks about God. If you claim to love God, but you don't love your neighbor, you neither know who your neighbor is, nor do you know who your God is. That God is least strongly thought of as being like the relationship of pure and perfect self-gift, of agapic love. That, I suggest to you, is what lies underneath and behind what the Pope is saying at this point. That God enters into us in this dynamic, this participation in the web of human relationships. And that is an enormous web. If I may give you two illustrations. One, a kind of scriptural puzzle, and the other, a personal story that I happen to know of. The first is, think of think of the remarkable way in which we hear in St. Paul that if Christ has been raised, all of us are raised. If Christ has not been raised, we are of all people the most to be pitied, says St. Paul. Well, you see, I used to think about that whenever it would come up in the readings in Scripture and I was going to preach on it. I kept running into the same puzzle. Half of it makes perfect sense. It's perfectly obvious. The other half, at least initially, I thought, can't figure out why Paul thinks that's clear. It's perfectly clear that if Jesus isn't raised, nobody's raised. You can understand what Paul means there. If Jesus has not been raised from the dead, no one should expect to be raised from the dead. Fine, I get that. What I don't get is why Paul says, if he has been raised, then clearly all of us are raised. Because I can imagine God raising Jesus and nobody else. I can imagine God raising Jesus and Mary and maybe Paul and possibly Peter, but skipping everybody else. I can imagine God raising a couple of thousand and skipping all the other hundreds of millions. Why does Paul think that if Jesus is raised, then clearly everyone is raised? Well, I have a suggestion. I don't know if this is what Paul meant, but it's one way in which I can make sense of that statement. It's a little bit like, think of an enormous and carefully knitted afghan laid out on the floor. And you take one knot in that afghan and start to pull it up. The whole afghan goes with you. You can't pull up one knot. You have to pull up the whole rug or the whole blanket. Well, the same thing is true about the human race. You can't raise Michael Himes and not get his mother, his father, his sister, his brother, his niece, his nephew, his teachers and friends, his next-door neighbors, because that's who Michael Himes is. Michael Himes is the point where all those things intersect. If there had never been a Mary Himes, if there'd never been a Robert Himes, if there were no Kenneth or Eileen Himeses, there'd be no Michael Himes. So if God's going to raise Michael Himes and hold Michael Himes in existence for all eternity, God has to raise Mary and Bob and Kenneth and Eileen and all those other people, because we are designed to be a web of interconnecting relationships. That's what it is to be a human being. We never stand alone before God. We always stand as one human being among all other human beings before God, because God has immersed God's self in our relatedness. The second is a story that I pass on to you. As I look out there, I realize there are some people like David who have heard this story before, so I ask your patience and your pardon as I bore you with it one more time. For those of you who haven't heard it, prepare to be fascinated. It's a story about a young Irish woman named Julia Collier, who in 1907 came to this country from her native little village in Duleek in County Meath in Ireland. She was 17 at the time, and she was accompanied by two friends of hers, just about the same age, from her little village. And to start their trip to the New World, they first left from Dublin and went across the Irish Sea to Liverpool, and they had to wait in Liverpool several days until the ship that was going to be taking them to New York was about to leave. And during those days, Julia became acquainted with a woman, or maybe some 8 or 9 years older than she, who had just within that week given birth to her first child and had given birth prematurely. Now, this woman's husband had gone over on a previous ship to get things ready to receive her when she came, and they thought that would be fine because nobody expected the baby to come that early. Well, here she is, 1907, was dangerous. Premature birth was very dangerous both to the mother and to the child. And so, but she couldn't not get on the ship because they certainly couldn't have afforded another ticket. So what was she going to do? Well, she was going to make the journey, but Julia volunteered to help her on the journey. She said, "Look, we're both going to be on the ship. I'll be happy to help you out." Well, they set off for the New World, and they get out into the North Atlantic, and it storms all the way. It's about as dreadful a crossing as you could imagine. Endlessly, the ship is pitching and rocking, and people are sick, and it's just awful. And one night out in the North Atlantic, Julia and her two friends from her home village back in Ireland are up on deck because it's so uncomfortable and so stuffy. There's just no air down below decks. So they're standing by the taffrail, even though the ship is pitching and tossing and waves are smashing into it. And along comes one of the ship's officers who said to her, "Miss Collier, Mrs. So-and-so, the mother of the newborn, is having a terrible time downstairs tonight. And she asked if I saw you, would I invite you to please go down and assist her? She would really appreciate your help." So Julia said, "Oh, right you are, I'll go right down." Her two girlfriends said to her as the officer walked away, "Oh, Julia, don't bother to go down. She could wait 5 minutes. And it's so stuffy, so uncomfortable downstairs." "Nope," says Julia, "the poor thing is in distress. I better go down and help her." So Julia starts down the stairs to the next deck, and before she reached it, there was a cry of "man overboard." A wave hit with such force precisely where she and her two girlfriends were standing that it actually broke the taffrail. Her two girlfriends were washed overboard, and neither was ever recovered. Well, why do I tell you that story? Because Julia continued on her way to New York and landed in New York. Some years later, married an Englishman she met in New York, named James Gill. James and Julia had a number of children, the eldest of whom was a daughter named Mary Gill. Mary Gill grew up and married a man named Robert Himes, and their eldest just told you the story. Now, why do I tell you that story? Because if 105 years ago, 106 years ago now, if 106 years ago, a 17-year-old Irish girl out in the middle of the North Atlantic had decided to wait 5 minutes on deck, she'd never have gotten to the New World. She wouldn't have married James Gill. There would not have been a Mary Gill to marry Bob Himes, and you would have a free evening. That's how we are hooked into all the countless decisions, choices, mistakes, choosing not to choose that mark our life. We are who we are because we're connected to everybody else. We are in relationship to everyone and everything else. If I could give you a rather strange example, but I think a true example, think about this podium. If I said to you, "Where is the podium?" you would say, "Well, it's up there in room 100 in Gasson. It's in the front of the room. Himes is standing behind it. I'm sitting in front of it." That's all that's true. It would also be true to say the podium is in North America. It would be true to say it's on the third planet out from the sun. It would be true to say it's a very long way from Buckingham Palace. It would also be true to say it's a lot closer to the White House. Of course, you can't get in at the moment because everything's shut down. But that in fact, you see, though some of those descriptions aren't very helpful. I mean, if somebody asked you, "Where is the podium?" and you said, "In North America," it's not going to help very much. But the fact is, it's all true. This podium is what it is because it's in some kind of relationship in space to absolutely everything else that exists in the universe. It may be far from, close to, left of, right of, above, below, near, far, to everything else. But it's all those relationships make this what it is. It's true of time. When does this podium exist? Well, it exists at the beginning of the 20th century. It also exists a long time after the death of the last dinosaur. It exists a good long time after Alexander the Great marched. And all of those descriptions, so again, not very helpful, are perfectly true. Everything that exists, including you and me, is in some kind of relationship to absolutely everyone and everything that has ever existed, does currently exist, or will ever exist. We're an enormous network of relationships. And that's where you meet God. One of the great indications of this that I particularly love in the New Testament is the opening of Luke's and Matthew's Gospels. It's the passage that most people hate to preach on. I must confess, I look forward to preaching on it whenever it comes up. It's the begots. So-and-so begot so-and-so, who begot so-and-so, who begot somebody, who begot the other one, who begot Joseph, who was married to Mary, who was the mother of Jesus. Why is that so important? It's important because what it's saying is if you want to find Jesus, you can only find him in the network of human history. That Jesus not only comes into history, as Gabriel comes into Mary's life like a bolt from the blue, but he also comes out of history. That all of history, everything that makes up the past of the human race, is also the past of Jesus of Nazareth. So if you want to know Jesus of Nazareth, you've got to know something about that network of relationships that includes you and me and all of the people we know, and even more, all of those people whom we don't know and never meet. The fact is, we are hooked into a network of relationships, and that's where God finds us. Consequently, the idea that I can be a fully committed Christian believer and not be part of a community of Christian faith is a misunderstanding of Christianity. It's a misunderstanding of humanity, as a matter of fact. It's to misunderstand that the way in which I come to salvation is through all of you. And the way you come to salvation, God help you, is through me. That we mediate salvation to one another. The whole human race mediates salvation. The whole of the universe mediates salvation. Because God comes to us not by breaking into relationships, but by emerging out of our relationships. My second point is a wonderful phrase that the Holy Father uses at one point when he says that God, we are not interested in the God who fits our own measure. If you get a God who, like Goldilocks' third attempt at eating porridge or finding a chair or going to bed for a nap, if you finally get the one that fits just right, it's not too big, it's not too small, it's just the God I'm looking for, you've got an idol on your hands. That's not God. God is never the God who fits our measure. God is the one who always pushes us beyond where we thought we could be. God is always a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit more puzzling than we expected God to be. If God meets your expectations perfectly, you are definitely wrong. And that's what the Pope is saying. But in saying it, he himself says, some people might think of this as being relativism. Aren't you saying that there isn't anything that you could say about God that is absolutely and simply true? Yes, there is something you can say about God that is absolutely and simply true, and it is that you have nothing to say about God that is absolutely and simply true. That's what you can't say about God. God is always mystery. One of the things that I observe in myself as well as in others with some amusement, I trust God gets a big kick out of it, is that after we say that we believe in the mystery of God, we start nattering on about God like we know what we're talking about. I mean, think of how many times you've heard people use a phrase like, well, you know, it was God's will. How do you know what God's will was? Did God drop a note to you in advance to tell you, I'm planning on doing this tomorrow, see what you think? The fact is that God is always that which we don't know utterly. God is always sovereignly mystery. After all, we're sovereignly mystery to one another. Why should it be that other human beings would be sovereignly mystery to me, but God I can know backwards, forwards, and inside out? What a strange claim. I like to say, my favorite way of putting this is that none of us has the truth, not one of us. But the truth has all of us. We don't have the truth, but the truth has us. We don't possess the truth, but the truth possesses us. The truth is something that we live out day after day, and in discovering what it means to try and live it out, we begin to get a clearer image of what it is. But we don't start by knowing the whole truth. Oh, we got all the doctrines straight. Now we can go out and get the morality straight, and then we'll be perfect. Well, no, we'll still have the liturgy to worry about. That in fact, that it's simply a matter of knowing the doctrines correctly, and then you will know what the proper behavior is, the proper lifestyle, the way you ought to live. What I'm suggesting is, first you start living it, and then bit by bit you begin to discover how you might describe it. You begin to put together a doctrine that makes sense because it's rooted in an experience you've already had. That's what the Holy Father says about why he rejects the claim that what he's saying is relativism. I reject it too. The third point I would want to make about the Holy Father's statements in this interview is he says that God is always in the processes. That God is not to be found in space because you can bind off space. You can decide exactly how much space you're going to give something. But you never can bind time. Time always includes the past, the present, and the future, and you certainly can't bind the future. That God is to be found as the Holy Father says at one point, in a narrative. God does not give us a set of doctrines, he gives us a story. And isn't that true? Isn't that what we find in Scripture? We don't find a catechism. What we find is a big collection of stories, all forming together one enormous connected story, what we call salvation history. And that it is only by incorporating into that story that we come to salvation. So that God is always in the processes, as the Holy Father says. Now, just think about that for a moment and realize how amazing it is to hear the Holy Father say it that bluntly and that plainly and that straightforwardly. That if God is always in the processes, what you can't ever say is the story is now done. We finished the story, we know how it ends. What's back, we know how it ends, we just don't know how we're going to get there. The image that I've liked to use over the years to talk about this, the younger members of the community this evening won't even remember these days, but there was a time when you could go to a neighborhood movie theater and the movies were being shown round the clock all the time. You didn't have to get there at a particular hour to see the start of the film. You could arrive at any time and then you just stayed into the next show and saw the beginning of the film that you had missed. And so sometimes it would happen that you'd arrive at the theater, I remember this very vividly as a boy, you'd arrive at the movie theater and go in and find out that you were 10 minutes ahead of the end of the previous showing of the film. So you saw that the butler did it, you found out the hero and the heroine lived happily ever after. You saw the whole conclusion. Then you stayed and saw the beginning of the film. Well, in a certain sense, that's where we are with the story of salvation history. We know how the thing ends. God wins. Love is bigger than hate. Forgiveness is bigger than sin. Peace is bigger than war. That ultimately God wins. God gets everything and everything gets God. How we're going to get there, we haven't a clue. We've still got to go through the rest of the movie to find out how we get to that conclusion, but we've already seen the conclusion. That's what we celebrate every Easter. That we've seen the end of the story. The end of the story is the tomb's empty and God is wildly and wonderfully alive. But how we're going to get there, we don't know. So we're always in the process, and we can never think we can step out of the process. We can never say, that's done, that's over, that's finished. God is never finished. Which leads me to my fourth point, one that the Holy Father returns to 4 times in the course of the interview, and it's the topic that he spends the single largest amount of time on, and it's that fine Jesuit virtue of discernment that he talks about. He begins by quoting a line. He says that it's been used to describe the vision of St. Ignatius. And he quotes it in Latin. I don't know where it comes from personally. If any of you do, any of my friends who are Jesuit in tradition may recognize this. In Latin, it's non coercere a maximo, sed continere a minimo divinum est. And the Holy Father translates that well, he doesn't translate it, I'm sorry. The translators put it in a way that is literally faithful to the Latin, but it seems to me it doesn't get the point. I'm going to offer a different translation, my own translation, a little freer, but I think it's faithful to exactly what the text is saying. That what the text says is, God's way is never to be overwhelmed by the biggest, but to be content with the least. Now think about that for a moment. That he says, if you want to see the world as God sees it, don't look to the big, overwhelming facts. Don't look to that which has power, that which has influence, that which seems to have everything in the palm of its hand. Don't look to persons or institutions or movements of thought and life that seem to have all the answers and have everything in its control. That it's more like the way God acts, not to be swayed by that, but to pay attention to the very smallest things. That's where you will discover the life of God really at work. That's the key to discernment. Don't look where you might expect to look. Look where it would never occur to you to have looked. And that's where you'll discover the presence of God. It seems to me it's not totally unrelated to a statement that I fell in love with some years ago. As the Pope says, he likes to quote that line often. Well, this is a line that I like to quote often, and it's from the great 16th century French essayist Michel de Montaigne. And in one of his late essays, Montaigne has this remarkable statement. I must confess, this is one of those things that I regard as a test of one's ethical maturity. If you get this, if you hear this line and say, oh yes, that's right, I agree with that, congratulations, you're an adult. If you are sitting there saying to yourself, I don't quite think I don't quite follow that, be patient, live a while longer, you may come to it. Montaigne says at this late essay of his, when I was a young man, I used to judge people by how much they had accomplished, how much they did. Now that I am older, I have changed my standard for judgment. I no longer judge people by what they have done, but by how much it has cost them not to have done so much worse. That is one of the most profoundly wise statements in the history of the Western world, as far as I'm concerned. That the real standard of measurement is not how much did you do, how much did you accomplish, did you finish the job as well as it could be done? The real standard by which a person is judged is how much did it cost you to get at least that much done? What did you have to give in terms of time and energy and creativity and imagination? How much courage did it take? How much effort did you have to put into it in order to get even that much done? That's the standard of measurement. Don't look for the big and the powerful. It is more like God to look for the small and the weak. And therefore, as we discern what the church is supposed to do, let us not look at standards of success that, we topped our goal in that collection. We've welcomed so many more people through the catechumenate into the community. We've been successful in founding new parishes, starting new schools, funding new hospitals and nursing care institutions, looking out for all sorts of social welfare programs. Those are wonderful. Those are absolutely splendid. But that's not the ultimate measurement. The ultimate measurement is, were you able to forgive your roommate? Did you put up with that nuisance thing that happened yesterday? When you were really disappointed in someone that you had great expectations and great confidence in, and you felt let down and betrayed, were you able to say it was all right and forgive them? If so, you are much closer to the way God sees things, the Pope suggests, than the person who thinks that it's the great deed that matters. God doesn't need our great deeds. God needs all of those countless little deeds which together make the big deeds, the big events, the great occasions possible. They've only become possible because of countless small deeds. The only reason you got to talk this evening was because a 17-year-old Irish girl decided that she wasn't going to stay on deck very much longer. How much did that cost Julia Collier? And how grateful I am to her that she made the decision. I'm also very grateful to the Pope for giving this interview because it gave me something to talk with you about. Thank you very much.
we invite your questions or comments, and we'll ask you to wait for the microphone to be passed to you. An unfolding process. We'll wait.
There may be a phone call shortly, you know, from Rome saying, did I say that? I didn't mean that.
Father Himes, thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I have a question to your first point that you made. So I'm wondering, given the what you've laid out about the interconnectedness of humanity and how we're saved through those relationships, well, I'm thinking right now I should just quit studying theology, take up drinking and gambling, and let myself be pulled up by the Himes Afghan. Can you talk me out of it? Is there some reason I shouldn't?
It certainly isn't a matter of quietism. Because you see, remember my emphasis is that we are mediating God to one another. That means not only that we are mediating God to you, but you're mediating God to us. The only way to receive the gift of God is to give it away. So it's never going to be enough to say, oh, well, then it's all gift. Thank you very much. I accept the gift. Now I'm fine, and I don't have to do anything else. Oh, yes, you do. You have to give it to somebody else. You have to give it away. The only way to accept a gift is to give it away. That, I think, is absolutely central to the whole of the Christian tradition. And consequently, the only way to accept the faith is to share the faith with another. The only way to receive life is to share life with another. So there's never going to be a point where we can say, oh, I don't have to worry about that. God takes care of that. I can relax, or the church takes care of that. Okay? Please, I think this gentleman also over here, too.
You're a hard act to follow, and my mind has gone to so many different places. But the Pope seems to talk a lot about space, and
Yes.
you just said something of space, and I'm thinking, you know, are we supposed to play before the Lord, filling in the spaces? And I also would like, if you could, comment on the comment that the Pope made about, or did he make, about making space for women in the church.
He does use that phrase. He also, you're quite right, he speaks a great deal about space in contrast to time. And I'm not sure where this comes from, because he's using space in a sort of, in an odd way. I can see what he's doing, but it's just, I've never seen anybody else do it quite that way. And let me see if I can find it quickly. There's one spot where he says this. Yes, here it is. God manifests himself in historical revelation, in history. Time initiates processes. And since he's told us God is in the processes, time is therefore a very powerful and affirmative and good thing in the church, in the Holy Father's vocabulary. God is in time initiates processes and space crystallizes them. And he goes on, crystallization there doesn't mean makes it into a sort of a gem. It quickly becomes obvious. It means it sort of makes it, it ossifies it. It gets old and stiff and confining. So whereas time is a very positive word in his vocabulary, space seems to be a sort of negative word. And I've never run into that before. We must not focus on occupying the spaces where power is exercised, but rather on starting long-run historical processes. We must initiate processes rather than occupy spaces. God manifests himself in time and is present in the processes of human history. This gives priority to actions that give birth to new historical dynamics, and it requires patience and waiting. What the Holy Father seems to be saying is that, that space is something that can confine us because we've got it. I mean, there it is. We could talk about the space of this room, and we know just what that means. It stops at that wall, that wall, that wall, and that wall. I mean, that is the space. It's all laid out. But if I said to you a phrase like my lifetime, well, I don't know how long that is. You see, that's necessarily open, because I can't say, and I know exactly how long the future is. I maybe know when I was born, but I don't know when I die. So the time is always out of my control. It's something I've got to live my way into carefully and faithfully and trustingly and lovingly. Space is something that, at least as the Holy Father seems to be using the term in this interview, is something much more controlled. I could say, yeah, you know, the field is 100 yards by 50 yards, and I know just that's the space, and I know that the whole space, but I never know that with time. That seems to be what he's saying, at least so far as I can understand the text at this point. But it's a very strange use of the word space. I've just never seen anybody else use it that way. But then again, I've never seen a Jesuit Pope before, so you know. Oh, this gentleman.
Yes. Hi, Father Himes. My mind is kind of going round and round here because you kept stimulating different thoughts. I couldn't help but think of chaos theory. And the idea that the beating of a butterfly's wings in New England could affect a storm on the African continent, and the interconnectedness that implies. And it seems like that would have salvific implication. You know, Paul saying, I make up what's lacking in the suffering of Christ.
Right.
So that there's that element where the entire body is doing the work of salvation. And at the end, when you were talking about focusing on the little things, it seemed to me that echoed the spirituality of Thérèse of Lisieux, whose feast day was just celebrated, and the little way. And I wonder if you could comment, is that where you were going with that?
Yes, it was, except the one thing I would add to it is that properly understood, there are no little things. You see, if the beating of a butterfly's wing can create a storm in Africa, then the beating of the butterfly's wing wasn't a small thing, it was an immense thing. What I think is being said, and that what the Pope is saying about discernment is, if you discern things properly, you discover there is nothing that is little. There is nothing that's trivial. There is nothing that's important. And therefore, something that looks like it's relatively unimportant compared to this great big issue is something that we have to be very attentive to, because it's not little at all. And that maybe the way in which ultimately one transforms the great big issue is by attending to the little issue, that's ultimately what will transform the big issue. The idea that we go right in and charge straight at that big issue and we've got to tackle it and put all our time and energy and resources into it, and that's how we'll deal successfully with it, may be entirely wrong. It may be that you start from the little thing, and that's what recreates the universe, as it were. Please.
You talked about, you used your Afghan analogy that we're all sort of, you can't raise one person in humanity without raising all others. How do you think that the Pope would respond to like the idea of heaven and hell then? So isn't it if we're all raised, then we all are raised, or if one fails and the whole body fails, do we not all fail together?
That's an excellent question. I have no idea how the Holy Father would respond to it. I'm not going to try and respond for the Pope, but I will give you my response. And it comes from, it's not purely mine, it comes from way back. One of the people who says this sort of thing repeatedly is one of the great Cappadocian fathers of the 4th century, St. Gregory of Nyssa, uses this example frequently, that Gregory will say, let me tell you about heaven and hell, or salvation and damnation. They're the same thing. They're exactly identical. But it's like this. This is Gregory's example. I will then give you my example, paralleling his. His example is, he says, think of a bright, beautiful, sunny day, and you've got perfectly healthy eyes. When you walk out into that sunlight, you're going to experience the sunlight as something pleasant and wonderful and something that's really just great. Now, says Gregory, change the experience a little. Now imagine, same beautiful sunny day, but now imagine that you have a disease of the eye. And when you walk out into that sunlight, now the sun hurts and it's painful and it's awful and you want to get away from it. Well, says Gregory, the sun didn't change, you did. And the same thing is true about heaven and hell. God gets everyone and everyone gets God. If you've always wanted God, congratulations, you're going to be very happy. If you don't want God, too bad, you're stuck forever. My image for it would be, imagine somebody coming up and throwing their arms around you. You could decide that that's an embrace and hug back. Or you could decide it's a wrestling hold and spend all your time struggling to break it. That's up to you. You decide whether God's embracing you or strangling you. If you think you're being strangled, be prepared to be strangled for all eternity. But if you think you're being hugged, be prepared to be hugged for all eternity. Okay?
Hi, Father Himes. Thanks
Hi,
for
how
your
are you?
talk. I was just, hi, Aaron. When the Pope was speaking about how you have to go out into the world and that's how you find God instead of thinking we know what God is and then going from there, I think I struggle personally a lot with the way that I feel when I go out into the world, and then that versus a lot of different church doctrine that when I try to follow it, I don't feel necessarily like I'm doing the most loving thing. And I wonder how a Catholic is supposed to navigate those two things, or if I was living the Catholic doctrine properly, would I be feeling like I was doing the most loving thing?
Well, I hope that if one understands Catholic doctrine properly, it would be life-enhancing and enriching and not something that is restrictive and impoverishing. I think what the Pope is saying, if I can go back to his article for a moment, he says at one point, this is the part that you may have seen quoted initially, because it was the thing that so many newspapers and journalists jumped on right away, was when he says, you're never going to advance the Christian message, you're not going to advance the gospel by insisting that it's a whole series of, as he says, ossified, petrified rules and regulations. It's a story and a proclamation, and you've got to tell the story and make the proclamation. Well, how far you want to push those ossified regulations? I mean, certainly, I think no one is ever wants to say, sometimes unfortunately we do say in practice, but we certainly don't ever want to say those rules and regulations, that's the essence of Christianity. That's certainly not what we're talking about. But there's a value to rules and regulations, and it is that it is the kind of accumulated wisdom of the community. That over the course of a long time, we've discovered that if you do this, if you follow this kind of pattern for doing things, it'll help. It'll work out all right. You'll find it enriching. You won't find it confining. If you do find it confining, then you've got some real discerning to do. See, that's why I think discernment is so important for him. That you've got to, if we thought that all we had to do was to say, well, here are the rules, here's canon law, here's the catechism, there's the bishop, over there's the Holy Father, and you just stick with them and you're all right. You don't have to think about it or worry about it at all. The Pope would say, no, you're in grave danger of ending up with, as he puts it, a God that fits your measure. That always we have got to recognize that we are people who are called, his word, to discernment. That we're people who have to discern what is the most truly loving, the most truly engraced, the most truly grace-mediating, grace-giving, the most truly agapic way to respond, to live, to think, to act in this circumstance. What we can't do is begin by saying, well, where are the rules and which ones apply? That's always going to be inadequate because it ends up with a God who fits our measure. Thank you so much for your attention this evening. It's a great pleasure, as always, to be with you.